I've watched this happen more than once. Someone clears out a closet that hasn't been opened in years, and everything gets sorted the same way. Old, plain, not worth keeping. Most of it really is. But before we're done, I'll tell you about one exception. A folded piece of fabric most people would never think twice about, that sold for more than most people paid for their first car. That's just one of 10 ordinary household items that have quietly sold for real money, and almost none of them look like it. Start with something so plain most people walk right past it. A wooden butter mold. Before refrigeration, families pressed their own butter into carved wooden stamps, and every farm or dairy had its own design. A cow, a wheat sheaf, a pineapple for hospitality, so buyers could tell whose butter was whose. Most of these sell for $15 to $150 today, honest money for a small kitchen antique. But earlier hand-carved examples, made before 1880 with genuinely detailed folk art carving, have climbed as high as $300, and the finest documented pieces have reached $500. Run your thumb across the carving. A crisp, uneven design usually means a real hand tool, while one too smooth and identical to the next was probably stamped out by a factory decades later. Here's where it gets interesting, because the next item is something almost every sewing box has a handful of, and nobody thinks to look twice. Old buttons, especially Bakelite ones, an early plastic invented back in 1909, are a genuinely active collector market right now. Most people see a jar of loose buttons and see clutter, not carved artwork, and that's exactly the mistake. A full jar of ordinary vintage buttons is worth checking, since collections regularly bring $50 to $500 depending on what's mixed in. But the real money sits in what collectors call realistics, buttons carved into the actual shape of a flower, an animal, a tiny fruit, and individual carved Bakelite pieces in strong, clear color have sold for as much as $1,500 each. Roll one gently against your teeth, an old trick collectors still use, since real Bakelite has a distinct, warm feel that plastic reproductions never quite match. And that's not even the strangest reversal I found, because the next item works backward from what you'd expect. Salt and pepper shakers get treated like the most disposable thing in any kitchen. 2 little jars nobody bothers packing carefully during a move. But certain sets, especially the figural pairs designed to fit together, a mermaid curled against a sailor, 2 bears locking arms, sell for real money specifically because they're a matched pair, and a single shaker separated from its partner is worth a fraction of a complete set. Ordinary examples run modestly, but the harder-to-find figural pairings climb into the hundreds when the paint hasn't chipped where the 2 pieces touch. Flip them over, too, since a stamp reading occupied Japan means the piece was made between 1945 and 1952, a window narrow enough to date it almost like a receipt. Now here's one hanging in plain sight on a kitchen wall that almost nobody thinks to check twice. A glass rolling pin might be the single most overlooked item most people own, because most assume anything glass in a kitchen is either depression glass or nothing at all. But these hollow glass pins have an older story. Sailors leaving port used to fill them with candy or trinkets and give them to someone waiting at home as a keepsake, sometimes with a hand-painted verse or a little ship worked into the glass. Plain examples sell modestly, but the swirled, multicolored versions, made from mixed scraps of glass at the end of a working day, have sold for over $200, and pieces with a painted verse climb higher. Hold one up to real light and look for tiny trapped bubbles, since that's your clearest sign of genuine hand-blown age rather than a later machine-made copy. From the kitchen wall to the front hallway, where the next item is one almost everyone steps over without ever looking down. Cast iron doorstops, the heavy figural kind shaped like an animal, a flower basket, or a standing figure, were genuinely popular decorating pieces from the 1890s through the 1930s, and one maker's name shows up again and again on the good ones. Hubley, out of Pennsylvania, cast doorstops shaped like everything from parrots to peacocks to baskets of lilacs, each hand-painted rather than left as bare iron. An ordinary painted example typically sells in the low hundreds. But a genuinely early piece, with its original paint still largely intact, can climb well past $500, and the rarest documented figural designs have reached into the thousands. Check the back for a mold number or the Hubley name cast into the iron, since a later repaint almost always costs more value than it adds. Head back into the kitchen for the next one, because cookie jars tell an even bigger story, and the range inside this one category is genuinely wide. A ceramic Little Red Riding Hood jar, made by several potteries over the decades, including Hull and Regal China, is one of the most consistently valuable figural jars ever produced, with clean original examples regularly reaching well into the thousands. A rarer version made by Brayton Laguna Pottery around the time Pinocchio hit theaters, showing the sinister coachman character from the film, has sold for $1,800 in its green coat and $3,500 in the rarer red one. Even a jar most wouldn't expect, a Regal China piece nicknamed Frightened Alice, has sold for $1,000 on its own. Check the bottom for a maker's mark first, since a slightly uneven hand-applied glaze usually points to an earlier run than a flat, perfectly even later reissue. Right next to that jar on the counter is where the next one hides. Mixing bowls carry their own kind of secret, one that's genuinely surprised longtime collectors more than once. Vintage Pyrex, the color-printed kind most kitchens had at least one piece of, is common enough that an ordinary bowl in a familiar pattern sells for $20 to $60, fair money for something used every week for decades. But one specific pattern, a 1959 test run called Lucky in Love, featuring pink hearts scattered across green grass and clovers, was apparently never widely distributed, and it's become the single most valuable pattern Pyrex ever made. A complete piece has sold for several $1,000s, and one well-documented example reached nearly $6,000 at auction. Check the pattern against a real reference before assuming a green and pink bowl is ordinary, because this design is rare enough that most collectors go years without ever seeing one in person. I want to be honest with you about how high an ordinary household item can actually reach, because the next one is a genuine outlier and I won't pretend otherwise. Cast iron skillets, the plain black pans most people already own and cook with, are collected under names like Griswold and Wagner, and most of what's sitting in kitchens right now is worth exactly what it looks like, $25 to $80 for an ordinary size in decent shape. But a documented Griswold No. 1 skillet, pattern number 411, with the rare early Erie spider logo stamped into the bottom, sold at a 2024 auction for $9,500, and a nearly identical example brought $9,750 just months later. That's genuinely rare air, not a typical find, and I don't want you thinking every black skillet in your cabinet hides that number. But the pan you cook eggs in still deserves one honest look at the logo on its bottom before it gets donated or scrapped for the metal. Step out of the kitchen entirely for the next one, into the one room most people never think to check twice. Sewing machines carry their own quiet surprise, especially the small black portable model nearly every seamstress's grandmother owned. The Singer Featherweight, Model 221, was built from the 1930s through the 1960s, and most surviving examples in working order sell for $100 to $250, genuinely useful machines quilters still actively seek out today. But certain rare versions change that number completely. A documented 1936 model marked for the Texas Centennial Exposition and an early first-run 1933 machine have both sold well over $1,000, some verified examples reaching close to $3,000. Check the serial number stamped into the bed of the machine, since that number alone can place it within the exact year it actually came from. And that's not even the shock that surprises people the most, because it finally brings me to the one I promised you at the start. Quilts get folded up in cedar chests and linen closets and mostly stay there, treated as something to keep rather than something to look at closely. Most antique quilts, even genuinely old hand-stitched ones, sell for a modest few $100s, real money, but not a life-changing number. But a specific style called a Baltimore album quilt, made mostly in the 1840s and 1850s, featuring elaborate appliqued blocks of flowers, wreaths, and sometimes even signatures stitched right into the fabric by the women who made each square, sits in a completely different category. One documented example sold at a 2006 auction for $58,000. Check the stitching under good light, since genuine hand quilting shows small, slightly uneven stitches that repeat but never sit perfectly identical, the same tell that separates real hand craftsmanship from a machine-made copy in nearly everything you've just heard about. Here's what ties every single one of these together, and it comes down to the same handful of things every time. Whether a maker's name or mark is actually stamped somewhere on the piece, whether the material and the workmanship are genuinely hand-done rather than machine-perfect, and whether the specific version you're holding was an ordinary run or one of the narrower, rarer windows that only lasted a year or two before the pattern or the factory moved on. None of that requires an expert eye. It just requires actually picking the thing up and looking closely instead of assuming a plain wooden mold or a chipped old jar belongs in a box headed for donation. My husband still keeps a coffee can full of mismatched buttons on his workbench that he swears came from his mother's sewing box, and every time I ask if he's actually sorted through it, he tells me he's been meaning to get to it right after he finishes whatever he's currently in the middle of, which has apparently been going on for about 6 years now. So before any of this ends up in a donation box or a yard sale table, take a real look first. Check the marks, check the stitching, check the paint, and see if what you're holding matches an ordinary run or a rarer one. Tell me down in the comments which of these 10 you've actually got sitting somewhere in your own house right now, because I have a feeling a few of you are about to go check tonight. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button and turn on notifications, because there's another one of these coming soon, and it's going to be worth checking too.